Dear President of the Hellenic Psychological Society and members of the Governing Board, dear colleagues, members of the Hellenic Psychological Society, dear students, dear friends, good evening, and welcome to today's webinar organized by the Hellenic Psychological Society. We have the pleasure of hosting our delighted, a distinguished scientist, an excellent psychologist and educationalist, Dr. Nicky Hayes, who is also currently the president of the British Psychological Society. She is joining us from the UK to give an inspiring talk entitled Psychology in Society, How Western Psychology Has Developed. Her talk is based on her upcoming book, A Little History of Psychology, which is published from the Yale University Press as part of the Little Histories book series. Dr. Hayes, we're truly honored to have you with us today, and we look forward to hearing your enlightening presentation. I would like to ask now the president of the Hellenic Psychological Society, Professor Nikos Makris, to give a brief overview of Dr. Hayes' biography and to formally welcome her at this scientific event. Nikos, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Irini. Dear members of the Executive Board of the Hellenic Psychological Society, dear former President of the Hellenic Psychological Society, dear Spiros, it's a great pleasure for me to see you today here. Dear members of the Hellenic Psychological Society, dear guests and friends of psychology, I'm pleased to welcome each of you to this insightful webinar organized by the Hellenic Psychological Society. Today, we have the honor of hosting a distinguished guest, Dr. Nicky Hayes, an accomplished psychologist, esteemed educationalist, and the current president of the British Psychological Society. Dr. Hayes began her academic journey in 1975, earning an honors degree in psychology from Leeds University. With a remarkable career, she is currently leading the British Psychological Society, influencing the direction of psychological research and practice in the United Kingdom. In addition to her administrative role, Dr. Nicky Hayes is a creative author, having written over 25 books covering psychology, management, and neuroscience. Her impact extends globally as her books are translated into multiple languages, fostering the exchange of psychological knowledge. Notably, I'm excited to share that Dr. Nicky Hayes' latest book, titled A Little History of Psychology, is set to be published next month. This upcoming addition to her extensive literary contributions promises to offer readers a concise, comprehensive journey through the fascinating evolution of psychology. Dr. Hayes' influence goes beyond her publications, which close to 10,000 citations according to Google Scholar, showcasing the recognition of her contributions in the scholarly community. As a psychology researcher, educationalist, writer, and mentor, she has significantly contributed to the field of psychology. Furthermore, Dr. Nicky Hayes holds esteemed fellowships with both the British Psychological Society and the British Academy of Social Sciences. Also, she serves as the British Psychological Society's representative for the International Union of Psychological Sciences, emphasizing her commitment to international collaboration. Today's webinar promises a deep dive into the historical interplay between psychology and societal evolution. Dr. Hayes will discuss how psychology has responded to societal changes over the years, exploring key moments like the World Wars, the cognitive revolution of 1980s, and the postmodern era. We feel privileged to benefit from Dr. Nicky Hayes' wealth of knowledge. As she generously accepted to share her insights, I invite you to join me in extending a warm welcome to a distinguished psychologist, devoted educator, accomplished author, and the current president of the British Psychological Society, Dr. Nicky Hayes. Dear Nicky, I really thank you for being here with us, and now the stage is yours.
Thank you, Nikos. Thank you so much for that introduction. I listen to an introduction like that and I think, oh, I would like to meet that person one day, because it never sounds quite real. But thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. And yes, I shall start my talk. I think I'll start my talk by sharing my screen, then you don't have to look at me, really. I think this is how we go. There. Can people see? Is it clear?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so before I start, I did say to some of you, I have to apologize that this is a very ethnocentric view. It's from American, British, and some European psychology, not all Western psychology, because I know very little about, well, I know some, but relatively little about other aspects of the West. So please excuse me if it seems very cross-Atlantic centered, but I think that also reflects the way it has been for most of the century. But psychology, as we know it today, certainly Western psychology, has multiple origins. It doesn't have a single origin. Even the very beginning of the formal scientific discipline in universities has two centers. Scholars argue about whether Wilhelm Wundt's laboratory in Leipzig came first, or whether William James's first course in psychology in Harvard was first, and actually they occurred in the same year or within a couple of years of one another. And then within just a few more years after that, there was Freud's establishment of the Vienna Circle, is that exploring psychoanalysis and the characteristics of the unconscious mind. And of course, there was already neuropsychology ever since Phineas Gage's dramatic accident and the discoveries of Broca and Wernicke. And it's important to remember, I think, that the first psychology, the first establishment of psychological laboratories and courses took place in a very different world from the one we have today. At this time, science was in transition, emerging from a period in which it was mainly undertaken by gentlemen scientists, or that is, people with an independent income who could spend their time exploring curiosities, or by talented individuals who were supported or sponsored by wealthy patrons. Science itself was just becoming institutionalized in universities, both in America and Europe. But the rigid distinctions between disciplines had not yet become established. William James, who is regarded as the father of psychology in America, saw himself as more of a philosopher than a psychologist, and his academic work reflects that. Wilhelm Wundt was appointed associate professor of anthropology and medical psychology in 1864, and he had an extensive background in anthropology, but he had also worked with Helmholtz on psychophysics, and his lectures were mainly on psychology, which was his major interest. I was privileged to see Wilhelm Wundt's personal library, which is in a university in Japan last year. And the breadth of that man's studying was remarkable. You know, anthropology in various languages, classic books, but scientific journals as well, and a real polymath. Anyway, the point is that psychology came together from very different origins. And in early years, this range of interests, was not seen as a problem. Early psychologists recognized that the mind was diverse and sometimes even fragmented, and that it simply wasn't practical to assume that one approach would be sufficient to explain it. Formal psychology, as expressed and taught by Wundt, James, and their followers, grew in popularity until by the 1910s, psychology was well established as a discipline in its own right in universities. World War I showed the relevance of psychology in the clinical arena. Shell damage taught psychologists a great deal about the areas of the brain. It showed how specific areas are connected with specific functions, how damage to the occipital cortex, for instance, produced blindness or partial blindness, and psychologists were able to identify the motor and sensory areas of the brain and auditory areas also through cell damage although these findings were later refined by surgical interventions. The phenomenon then known as shell shock, which we now know as PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, also showed how psychological knowledge could be valuable in understanding emotional problems. And while clinical psychology as such didn't yet exist, psychologists began to be involved in these areas as a result of the war experience. And of course, psychoanalysts, because it wasn't yet separated as a discipline, psychoanalysts provided therapy also to those suffering from their war experiences. Freud had set up more than one center for counseling and so on. After World War I, the dominant social movement known as modernism began to take hold in Western society, particularly in America. And part of this movement was the idea of the universal theory, the idea that one day science would reveal a single underlying explanation that would unify and clarify each science. The idea took hold in science as a whole, particularly in physics, but it also had its equivalents in psychology in the form of Watson's behaviorism and his insistence that the basic unit of learning, the stimulus-response connection, underlies all human experience. The behaviorists insisted that learning theory was sufficient to explain everything about human psychology, and that was an idea that was taken up by Skinner and eventually resulted in his assertion that freedom and dignity were simply social illusions and that everything was conditioning under the surface. But that came later, and between the wars there were several different approaches also running parallel in psychology. In America, the American dream was paramount, with its insistence that any individual American could achieve success through their hard work and initiatives. In keeping with this, social psychology, which under Wundt had included cultural and societal influences, was redefined by Allport as a strictly individual discipline. Allport argued vehemently that the individual was what mattered, that social institutions, traditions, culture, and conventions were all nothing more psychologically than reflections of the psychology of the individuals comprising them. While behaviorism, or at least the strict experimental approach it was based on, and individualism came to dominate American psychology, the interwar period in Europe reflected economic anxieties and a growing nationalism. And this was a climate in which the Gestalt school, which looked at human experience in a much more holistic manner, developed and became particularly strong, particularly as so many Gestalt psychologists witnessed the rise of Nazism and the way in which it came to dominate beliefs in ways that were not really very easy to explain on a purely individualistic level. Psychoanalytic perspectives also dominated clinical work at this time. And again, those were inimical, yes, totally opposed to the behaviorist or unstrict experimental approach of the American schools. World War II changed psychology dramatically. In part, this was through the increased use of insights from psychology to solve military problems, such as how long someone could pay attention to a radar screen without making mistakes, or how submarinists could deal with the perceptual distortions they encountered underwater. That generated a new interest in cognitive psychology, preparing the ground for the cognitive revolution of the 1980s. I must apologize for my illustration there. The rabbit duck figure, I think, is actually from the 1920s, but it just seemed an appropriate way of illustrating perception. So my apologies for the anachronism there. This interest in cognitive processes went hand in hand also with the code-breaking processes in which a lot of psychologists were involved, and of course the development of the early computers, which were also a legacy from the war years and which led also to an interest in how the human mind processes information. Another outcome of World War II was an increased awareness of the mechanisms of propaganda and persuasion. The German Nazi Party, of course, had made this a speciality, and this attracted considerable interest on the other side of the Atlantic as well. J.S. Bruner's doctoral thesis, for example, was on the use of radio broadcast by belligerent nations. So it wasn't surprising that he was quickly drafted into Eisenhower's psychological warfare division. Like other psychologists involved in the war effort, he wasn't able to publish his work directly, but his post-war publications on rumour and persuasion indicated the direction his work had taken, and later informed his seminal work on beliefs and representation. Social psychology was brought into prominence after the war by the work of a number of experimental social psychologists in America who sought to explain how Nazism could have dominated Europe in the way that it did. Solomon Asch, who was a Gestalt psychologist in America, opened up the field with his work on conformity, which was followed up by his student Milgram's seminal work on obedience and a number of other relevant studies. These social psychologists generally followed Allport's individualistic approach. For example, Milgram explained his findings on obedience by proposing that individuals adopt an agentic state, a state of agency in which they surrender their personal autonomy and simply see themselves as the agents of authority. This individualistic approach tended to regard social context and other social factors as a kind of optional input, and this was very different from the European trend and a sign of an emerging difference between American and European social psychology. But less positive things were also happening at the time. The Cold War generated an era in Western psychology of which we can be rightly ashamed. In its worst manifestation, it was a massive American intelligence project called MK Ultra, a top secret, wide-ranging set of explorations of mind control. The project used cover organizations to finance psychological research in a wide range of areas, from the effects of psychoactive drugs to the use of hypnotism. But the money was dispensed through cover organizations, as I said, and most of the psychologists and other scientists involved had no idea that they were actually working for the CIA. When the Watergate affair happened, the CIA chief ordered all MK Ultra files to be destroyed in case they became public. But some documents had been misfiled in another building, which is how the project came to light many years later. There had always been rumors. While I was a student, there were rumors about the CIA experiments, and it was widely known that they had done these things, done some things, but they'd always been consistently denied. So these documents were invaluable evidence. They showed how the experiments included sensory deprivations, starvation, responses to torture, dosing unaware people with psychedelic drugs, just about anything they could imagine. Moreover, the experiments were brutal, often leading to lifelong trauma and illness, and frequently carried out on those who are unable to protest. It's a dark side of psychology's history, and we don't know nearly enough about it, and some of it we'll never find out. But the post-war period also saw more positive developments, as societies in Europe began to rebuild, and in particular, as consumer society developed and came to dominate domestic concerns. Research into attitudes and person perception flourished, as did psychotherapy. There was an increased focus on the individual, which fostered a growing awareness of the humanistic approach promoted by psychologists such as Rogers and Maslow. And as those ideas took hold, alternative approaches to psychotherapy also began to challenge the established psychoanalytic approaches. The work of Rogers, Ellis, and Beck spearheaded new ways of doing psychotherapy with an emphasis on behavioral change and personal agency, rather than on exploring the depths of the unconscious mind. But that was based on psychological research into agency, whereas psychoanalysis used very different evidence. And that epistemological difference between the two eventually became so extreme that that the psychology and psychotherapy, psychology and psychoanalysis eventually split into two completely different disciplines, at least in Britain and America. The academic expansion of the post-war years also led to a boom in scientific research, and neuropsychology flourished as key medical advances in the post-war era enhanced our understanding of brain functioning. Discoveries like the nature of neurotransmitters clarified the actions of brain chemicals and psychoactive drugs, and surgical interventions highlighted important aspects of brain activity, like the quasi-independent operations of the two different halves of the brain and functional centers on the cerebral cortex, which seem to determine various functions like movement and language and the senses. Always a part of psychology from the very beginning, neuropsychology's importance was considerably enhanced during this period. And if you look at textbooks from that period, you'll find that they tend to start off with the structure of the neuron and work from there, because it was regarded as such a central part of psychology. By the 1980s, the cognitive revolution was in full swing. Psychologists who had been interested in cognitive research during the war years were able to bring together their experiences with subsequent laboratory research and to develop theories stimulated by those experiences. Younger psychologists drew on increasingly sophisticated laboratory techniques to advance knowledge in areas like perception, memory, and information processing. Some psychologists developed computer-based models, seeing the human brain as being like a computer, like Baddeley's working memory model, while others emphasized how prior knowledge and expectations shape our perceptions and our memories. In social psychology, the differences between American and European perspectives were becoming increasingly apparent. Mid-century experiences in Germany, Italy, and Europe as a whole had made it evident that the individualistic approach advocated by Elphort was inadequate to explain how whole societies could become dominated by single ideologies. A European social psychology developed during the later part of the 20th century. It emphasized how shared interpretations of reality developed through group affiliations and encouraged research which could explain how group membership affects both individual behavior and cognition. In the US, that research existed too. It had its origins with Gestalt psychologists who had emigrated to America to escape the Nazis, such as that of Carolyn and Mustafa Sharif, while in Europe they were spearheaded by the work of Henri Tajfel in the UK and Serge Moscovici in France. Identifications, attributions, and social representations all added to the breadth of mainstream psychology, allowing a much clearer understanding of the relationship between the individual and their culture. In the decades after the war, science and scientific research had been considered to be the key to all social progress. Scientists looked for peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Some people may remember the radium watch dials and the glow-in-the-dark toys, which were commonplace in the 1950s and 1960s. And there was a belief that science was inherently neutral, and it was up to society whether it used scientific advances for good or evil. But as the century wore on, doubts as to the all-important value of science grew. The postmodern movement was a direct challenge to the modernism of the interwar period, with its emphasis on relativism and the rejection of absolute standards. But this in turn produced a reaction as people argued for values, and an increasing concern with the social responsibility of science emerged. Psychology inevitably reflected these social concerns, and some psychologists began to question both the relevance of psychology's methodology and the ethics of experimentation. Academic psychology as a whole at this time was largely dominated by the strict behavioral experimental paradigm. The cognitive revolution had shown that there was more to human learning than just behavior change, but the dominant approach still emphasized quantitative measurements and statistical analysis, despite its limitations and the growing doubts about its validity. This was a legacy from the behaviorist movement's insistence on psychological research being scientific. But treating living people as if they could be manipulated like the inert matter of the physical sciences was becoming increasingly implausible, as the proliferation of experimental controls generated ever more artificial situations. Demanding numerical data which could be subjected to mathematical operations was also becoming increasingly restrictive, as psychology moved towards a more realistic appraisal of the human mind. Concern about ethics grew as psychologists challenged the value of research which ignored the active and inquiring nature of the human beings used in psychological research. Far from being passive subjects, campaigners pointed out that people make their own sense out of what they're experiencing and should more usefully be regarded as participants in the research process, not as inert subject matter being manipulated. That concern resulted in a series of ethical guidelines, several of which directly challenged psychological orthodoxy. The participants' right not to be deceived, for example, was one of those. Conventional research controls depended on deceiving the subject so as not to contaminate the results. So adherence to the guidelines meant rethinking the whole way that research questions were asked and how research was conducted. At this time, too, there was an increasing concern with planetary issues, animal welfare, and concerns about how animal research was conducted. Guidelines for animal research were introduced. They reflected the wider social movements like the Save the Whale campaigns and objections to farming animals for their fur. And the unnecessary use of experimental animals was part of that campaign. When I was an undergraduate in the early 1970s, conducting an animal experiment and learning, usually rats in mazes, was a course requirement in many psychology degrees. By the 1980s, that had vanished and only real research with animals was allowed. And a series of militant attacks on animal laboratories, combined with the publication of ethical guidelines for research with animals, restricted that type of research even further. So we know about some of the studies that were conducted on animals, some of which were really quite unpleasant. If you think of Brady's monkeys and the induction of stomach ulcers through stress, those sorts of things, they may have told us something, but they were certainly, I don't think they would be accepted as ethically responsible nowadays. As consumer society continued to expand and individual interest diversified, people's interests became more self-focused and more concerned with individual differences and what makes me, me, as it were. Psychometrics flourished, moving far beyond intelligence and personality testing, and ideographic approaches to psychometric measurement like Kelly's personal construct theory and Rogers' Q-sort were developed. Psychological knowledge such as nonverbal communication became widely known in psychology, to the point where body language, which was a strictly psychological issue in my first years in psychology, it's now an everyday concept. And pop psychology books have moved from pseudo-psychoanalysis, such as how to interpret your dreams, to pseudo-psychology, such as what type of person are you? Whether that's been a good development or not is a matter of personal opinion, but it does demonstrate the growth of general interest in psychological knowledge, which has accompanied the growth of consumerism and the me society. The final 2 decades of the 20th century were marked by economic change, a transition from Keynesian economics to a much stricter version of capitalism and the global market economy. By this time, the computer age was well established. Desktop computing was commonplace and artificial intelligence was more than an infant, although not yet fully grown. This naturally led to research into judgment and decision-making, showing how human decision-making differs from the strict logic applied by computers. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky conducted a program of research during the final decades of the century, which revealed systematic biases in how people make judgments and decisions. Their work not only had relevance for those involved in computer simulation and artificial intelligence, but also had demonstrated relevance for the business world. Recognition of the value of this work eventually resulted in the award of a Nobel Prize to Kahneman in 2002, which would have been shared by Tversky, but he had sadly died a few years earlier. The optimism of the new millennium was reflected too in the learned optimism of Seligman's positive psychology, which opened up many new areas for psychological research, while at the same time bringing together significant ideas from key psychologists of the past. Seligman's work has begun in the late 1960s, where his research into learning theory had identified the process of learned helplessness, a key insight into the nature of depression and very widely used by therapists. But by the 1990s, he was exploring its opposite, learned optimism. And this led him to an increased awareness of research into human flourishing and positive cognitions. He pointed out how psychological research tends to deal only with the negative aspects of human experience. And he used his 2000 presidential speech for the American Psychological Association to promote positive psychology as an explicit area of psychology. The increased interest in self and personal experience brought on by the growth of consumerism also generated impatience with the limitations of traditional research methodology, and the new century saw an important methodological change in psychology. While mainstream psychology had quite rightly eschewed anecdotal evidence, researchers were recognizing that converting everything into numbers often lost valuable meanings, and that was increasingly seen as limiting what psychology could address or investigate. A strong pressure towards the acceptance of more open methodologies and acceptably scientific forms of qualitative analysis had developed, and more psychologists showed how systematic qualitative analysis could be as rigorous as quantitative analysis, and was very, very far from the anecdotal evidence that psychologists had been taught to distrust, quite rightly. Gradually, it became accepted as a valid method of analysing research data, until by the 2010s, a balance between qualitative and quantitative methods and analysis was becoming a normal feature of psychology courses. Neuropsychology also showed significant changes as we moved into the new century, as technological developments meant that brain scanning equipment became much more available to researchers, rather than being explicitly restricted to the medical world. Three particularly significant observations from this were the establishment of, or the identification of mirror neurons across the brain, which showed how we have a neural basis for empathy, which is important for empathy and social interaction, important for a social species, and certainly clarifying why it is that we appear to feel other people's pain or are concerned when we see distress. Then there was also the firm establishment of neuroplasticity and the knocking on the head of that stupid belief that neuroplasticity ended at the age of 12 or 20 or whatever age you wanted to name. What the brain scanning showed was that the brain can develop and form new connections in adulthood as well as in childhood. And this was sort of already known by people who were dealing with recovery from strokes and aneurysms, but it was good to have a proper scientific evidence for it. And neuroplasticity has been shown to be something which can happen at any age, but it's not, as anybody who has tried to recover from a stroke knows, it's not easy, but it can be done. And then the third really significant insight was the way that the realization that the brain works in terms of networks rather than nodes, that even though a facility, even though a facility might have a particular key area in the brain, in practice, its actions will be part of a significant network of neural activity involving many different areas of the cortex. So we come to the new century, and now we're a quarter of the way through it nearly. And the new century has been distinguished really by a general social trend across society to recognize excluded or underrepresented individuals, like acknowledging the many women who had contributed to art and science in the past, not being recognized from the rest, with a number of female psychologists whose contributions had been either ignored or entirely written out of psychology's history. The work on group processes, generally attributed to Mustafa Sharif, for instance, had, as he personally acknowledged, mainly been the work of his wife Carolyn, but owing to the prevailing sexism of the time, it could not be published under her name. Sharif himself was angry about this, but not in a position to change a self-satisfied and immovable male establishment. That society-wide trend to reevaluate minority things raised again the often voiced methodological concerns about the traditional limitations of sampling in psychological research. Several individuals had asked over the years whether the American undergraduate could truly be considered a human being, or at least representative of human beings in general. But it took until the 21st century for these concerns to be taken seriously. It's steam engines when it's steam engine time, as the saying goes. Analysis showed how much of psychology's traditional research evidence was based on weird populations, that is, populations drawn from Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic societies. This acknowledgement became linked with concerns about the representativeness of mainstream psychology for different cultures in the world, and an increased interest in deconstructionism, the analysis of political, like colonial and patriarchal influences on psychological theory. And that in turn led to a concern with the development of indigenous forms of psychology, which would be able to integrate traditional cultural awareness and knowledge with universal insights into mainstream psychology. So not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as the saying goes, but integrating what we know of value from mainstream psychology with indigenous traditional knowledge. So what we have now, as we move towards the second quarter of the 21st century, is an increasingly pluralistic psychology, reflecting our increasingly pluralistic knowledge of human society. But that doesn't invalidate all our previous psychological knowledge, because that pluralism is linked under the surface by our knowledge of psychological mechanisms and processes which are basic to the human condition. And, as I said at the beginning, psychology has always been pluralistic. From the very beginning, there was no single psychology, just different schools of thought which came together with a common interest. For psychologists, that's a strength, not a weakness. Human beings are complex and ever-changing. We've grown out of looking for a single universal theory which can explain everything about people. But as psychologists, we know a great deal about people and how they work, and our ability to draw on different perspectives and sources of knowledge is an important part of the strength of any psychologist. Thank you.
Nicky, we thank you for the comprehensive and fruitful presentation. And I think that now we can proceed to the questions, if there are some questions from the audience.
I don't see anyone raising his hand.
I'm trying to raise my hand. Okay.
Okay.
Yes,
So,
Zoe.
I was looking for the key, sorry. Thank you so much for this talk. While you were presenting, I was thinking, and I would like to have your viewpoint on that. I was thinking that Western psychology, as we define it, does not take cultural aspects very much into account. And I find this to be a major drawback. What's your opinion on that, Nicky?
I fully agree with you. I think it is a major drawback, and I think it's something that the psychology that is to come is going to be addressing, because there are pressures now to address this sort of issue, which there weren't before. I mean, the assumption before was that, oh, well, our viewpoint counts for everybody, you know, that the American ideal, you know, you can see it in theories, in models like the need for achievement as a universal need. No, I don't think so. Some cultures have that, some cultures don't, you know.
The idea that we are the center of the universe somehow.
Yes, that's right. The ethnocentricity of the but I think this is breaking down now. I mean, certainly in the UK, there's a very strong movement for decolonialism, is what they call it. The decolonizing the psychological curriculum is a major thing, and quite a lot of the university courses have modules which are about teaching students how to recognize those sort of patriarchal inputs, or, you know, how to identify those kind of things. The other thing that I think is really quite exciting is the way that people are finally starting to recognize the work of people like Frantz Fanon, who was a major theorist about colonial identity, but not really very well recognized in non-colonized cultures, you know, and he was writing, well, I was introduced to his work in the 1970s, but not by a psychologist, but by a Marxist friend who said, read this. But he had a great deal of influence on many of the campaigns of people like Malcolm X in America, or, you know, the anti-colonial campaigns that took place during the second part of the 20th century. And I think there is a Frantz Fanon University in Algeria, I think, and I'm glad to see it being more recognized in mainstream psychology. So I think there is a wish now for more cultural awareness. Our challenge is how to get it in, you know, how to build it in and absorb it into mainstream psychology, so that we can become less ethnocentric and more aware of the fact that the world is a big place and people don't all think the same way.
We have a hand, Barbara Dimitrea.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. I was wondering, you actually, I was thinking about something the whole time that you were speaking, and I think you partially answered my question from the previous question. But where is there anything that you see happening right now? Do you have any feelings about where this next generation is going as far as changes? Because there's actually more acceptance, I think, of psychotherapy in more cultures now. I think that might be something that might actually begin to go along with the change that might be happening.
I think that's right. I think it's very hard to speak globally because every country is happening differently. But I was at an international symposium in Japan in September, and there was somebody there from the Philippines who was talking about the way that they have managed to, the Psychological Association has managed to establish psychotherapy as a basic principle in all sorts of social interventions and things. And their challenge really was getting governments and decision makers to recognize that.
Mm-hmm.
We have to be very clear about that. But there's also very much more to psychology than just psychotherapy. And I think when you talk about, I mean, certainly within my organization, it's a constant push to try to make sure that people recognize we have large numbers of organizational psychologists helping in management and things. We have large numbers of forensic psychologists helping in prisons and predation services and things. So there's much more than psychotherapy. And I think we need to be very clear about that, because I suppose psychotherapy is something that with enough pressure, you can get a politician to understand, sort of understand, insofar as they understand anything. But it's harder for people to understand the value that a psychologist brings in other walks of life.
Oh, it definitely is, because theoretically it seems like it's more acceptable, and there seem to be positions in different settings, but at least in Greece they're not usually filled. I mean, like a school psychologist might have 1 day a week in a school. So the importance isn't really, it's not there yet.
No, I think it's something that psychology associations are wrestling with all over the world, really. And part of it, I think one of the many aspects of solutions is to try and get more psychology graduates to go into public office. I mean, it's not a thing that people often like to do, because psychology graduates tend to be, or psychologists, professional psychologists tend to be rather lacking in the kind of egoism that says, I am me and most important, and more important than anybody else. So they don't tend to go for public office.
Not often that you would see those two traits in the same person, I think.
That's right. But nonetheless, we have one or two psychologists in public positions in the UK, and they are invaluable, really.
Very helpful. That would be very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I do some consultancy work with a firm of AI specialists, you know, and they, I'm talking, when we're talking about the way they're designing things, I'm saying what I think is just common sense, and they're going, wow, that's really interesting. We didn't realize that. And that's what psychologists bring a different perspective to things, and they help people to see things from other points of view. And we have to work on articulating that value. It's really important, because it's a very special thing. Partly, I'm talking a lot about how our diversity is our strength, and I think that's right. I mean, because we can deal with more than one point of view at a time, that allows us to do problem solving in unusual places and in ways that we don't realize. Sorry, this has gone way off the history bit, but I hope it answers the questions a little bit.
It was probably my question, but I just thought, you know, as a continuation of what you were saying, you know, we could talk about the future. Thank you.
I don't know the future.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank
Eleftheria, Professor Eleftheria Gonida from Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, Nikki.
Nice
Thank
to
you
meet
very
you.
much. It's our pleasure and honor to have you with us here today.
Okay.
I have a question about I would like to hear your opinion about the role of technology, and particularly generative AI in the future of psychology, not to mention of education, of course, because that's another story, but let's stay in psychology. So thank you. You mentioned something about working with AI specialists, but the question is also the other way around.
Yes, I mean, they are people who are developing a particular thing for an industrial problem, but I think there are several aspects to the AI issue. I mean, there's a big academic problem. You get something like ChatGPT, and I have spoken to a couple of psychologists who've tried to use it, and they've found that it makes up academic references. You know, one of them was doing some research into an area which he thought was new, and he asked ChatGPT, and it turned up with 10 papers, you know, on that area. So he was quite surprised. So he tried to get hold of them, and he found that most of them actually didn't exist. There were people researching in related areas, but it had compiled what it thought would probably be an appropriate reference. So that's fine if it's a psychologist who's looking at the sources, but if it was a journalist, they wouldn't know the difference. They would assume it was real research. And another person said, yes, he'd had that sort of experience, and also he'd asked ChatGPT for some things, and it had come up with a paper between two researchers who definitely researched in the area, but with the date of the paper and what it said, one of them would have had to be 7 years old when he'd actually written it, you know, because the paper itself was not real. It was a synthesis of what ChatGPT knew about those people. So that's one problem, I mean, which is a problem. There are assets as well. I don't think artificial intelligence is all bad. I think there are ways in which it can be really, really useful. And it's a question of having to live with it, isn't it? I mean, one of the things I find quite interesting when I'm working with people working in artificial intelligence, it's just, well, actually, a lot of psychologists, younger generations, don't realize that one of the very first AI programs was ELIZA, which was a therapy program. I don't know if you know about ELIZA, but it was a therapy program which in the 1960s, I think it was developed. It was just question and answer. You typed in your question and it produced an answer, and it did it mostly by non-directive approaches. You know, you'd say something, you mention your mother, and it would say, and how do you feel about your mother, and so on. And people would type in all sorts of stuff and insist that it really helped them with their problems. Well, it possibly did, you know, because it allowed them to reflect on it. But there are ways that those sorts of things can be useful. There are ways that it can help in looking at new approaches to things, but I think we have to be cautious. in using it is really what I have to say. And I don't know nearly as much about it as I ought.
Yeah, I agree. I think we have to be cautious, and actually, and of course, we can't say we can't neglect it. I mean, that's
no, but it's
sure.
It's not going away. That's the thing.
No, it's not going away, and I think we have to work a bit. I think we have to work harder in how we educate our students.
Yes,
our
we do.
prospective
And there are
psychologists.
aspects of it that drive me wild. I mean, if I'm searching for something, I'm searching for that thing. And half the time I get some artificial intelligence thing that tells me, oh, no, here's something that's similar. You can have that instead. And I don't want that instead. I want that,
Yeah.
you know.
And I still have to have the knowledge to
Yes.
evaluate what ChatGPT will give me. So it's still the way we educate.
Absolutely. People need to be aware of, our students in particular need to be aware of how these things can happen.
Yeah,
Yes.
because it's not easy for them to resist to the easiness of having these things.
Oh,
And we see
right.
that every day, I think. Yeah. Thank you.
I think so too. Yes.
Nico, I don't see anyone else raising his hand, so you can ask.
I have two questions, but I will just ask the first one. And
Okay.
if we have time, then I will proceed to the second one. The first one is somehow general question. What advice would you give to a young person who decides to pursue psychology professionally in nowadays?
You mean somebody who's already studied it a little bit and wants to go on to become...
Someone who is planning to study, or someone who has already finished his or her basic studies?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'd say go ahead and do it. I think it will help in a lot of ways, not just in getting a job. And one thing is it never hurts to have a profession and to become an established professional, you know, an accredited professional. So there are, and that's one of the reasons why training for professional psychology is often quite lengthy and involves a lot of supervision and things. But that's partly because you are then recognized as holding a certain level of expertise and a certain level of responsibility for that expertise. But there are personal reasons too. I think it will enrich your life. I think the understanding of psychology and the depth of understanding of psychology that psychological training gives you is really something that does help you to understand people better. It allows you to explore aspects. It allows you to listen to people and listen under the surface, as it were, not just to take things for granted, but to say, well, how did they come to that belief or that idea, or that, why did they respond in that way, you know? And the thing about psychology is, because it trains you in doing that, it becomes second nature. In fact, it becomes unconscious. You don't realize you're doing it, but you do it. And you are more able to understand what is going on around you. It also, I think, helps you to develop clear thinking. I think that's part of the problem, perhaps, or part of the issue is that you don't get overwhelmed by too many factors, but you can see your way through them. You can look for solutions. You can say, these are the essential parts of this problem. You know, somebody is telling you about a problem, or somebody is identifying a load of issues, and you think, right, okay, which are the ones that matter? And you can come straight to those. I mean, it does help you with clear thinking, sorting your way through. And so I suppose it's a good thing to do for your own personal development. It helps you to get a more meaningful life of your own, as well as being a good thing to do in terms of your professional development and the fact that you are then able to have a working career which does involve helping people, which is not a small thing at all. It's a major thing, and it's something that helps you to develop what Seligman would call a meaningful life, you know, rather than just working for the sake of, you know, bringing home the pay packet. I mean, the pay packet is important. I wouldn't knock that, but the ability to have some confidence that what you're doing is worth doing is even more, it is just as important, I think.
Okay, thank you. Any question? Any other question?
Well, I might have one question. In part, has been replied, but I'll give it a try, and maybe it's a huge one. I'm not sure. So first of all, I would like to thank you very much for your excellent talk. I would like to ask you if in all this process of trying to mapping the history of psychology, have you studied the effects of non-Western cultures on the development of Western psychology? I mean, it's surely a kind of interaction between different cultures and different perspectives and different ways of thinking and living. And I believe that Western psychology has affected non-Western cultures, but is it also vice versa? Do you have any kind of information or on that?
It has affected it, yes. I mean, it has been, but it's been mostly one directional. But I think there have been some examples. I think, for instance, when I was in Japan, I was asking about Japanese psychology, and they are much better developed in terms of research into well-being and human interaction than we have been in Britain, for instance. That's a much more highly developed research area for them, because and there are ways, but what my account of Western psychology and how it's developed has really shown me is how much we're not influenced. As I say, people like Frantz Fanon, who had really important things to say about identity under a colonial system, you know, where your personal identity is not your personal identity, it's shaped by society's racism, as it were, you know, so you see yourself in those terms, as well as just, it's not just you, it's that, and there are sort of insights there. And I think, you know, one of the things that in the book I touch on psychology in other countries, but very, very superficially. I mean, some forms, I mean, Russian psychology has had quite a lot of influence on Western psychology. So I suppose there are some areas, but then it's a moot point whether or not you count Russia as the West, you know, certainly in terms of the way they were very involved in psychology at the beginning, you know, and Pavlovian insights. And then after the revolution, of course, they went their own way. But nonetheless, people like Luria and Vygotsky and so on have been really influential. So there has been a trickling of influence. But again, I think that's ethnocentric. I think that's because they were regarded largely as sort of our distant European cousins, you know. Yeah. I think we can learn a great deal, and I would love to be able to make that my next writing project, would be to sort of look at different psychologies around the world. But I really don't know of a publisher who would accept that, and still less do I know of any way of funding it. So we'll leave it as an ideal for now, but it's something, there's certainly a wish to become more culturally aware. And that is one of our challenges, I think, for the future. And I think that's one of the things that we will all need to work on, really. You know, international collaboration is good. I mean, but so far we've had a lot of international collaboration in terms of within Europe, but we need a lot more with places like the Philippines and, you know, places that are not mainstream Europe and are able, you know, Southeast Asia is very well developed in psychology, Vietnam, Korea. My book has been translated, so I'm just looking down the list. The book, Vietnamese, Thai, Japanese, Korean, and then Ukrainian and Portuguese. So already they have sold the translation rights to those. What that tells you is there's a big interest in psychology in those countries. You know, if they're going to translate a book like A Little History of Psychology into those languages, and the publishers were quite surprised to get those contracts very quickly. But that tells you there is a lot we can learn from them, as well as them learning, you know. I think the American model and the British model and the European model, they've been, which country at the moment is more dominated by which largely is a history of colonialism. You know, if you look in South American psychology, you've got some countries follow the American model more, some countries follow the French model more. You know, it really depends on how it's gone historically. But we need to start bringing that influence back much more. And that's on that's on all of you, really. I was going to say all of us, but, you know, I'm 70 now. I'm not sure how much influence I'm going to have in the future, but it's something for psychology for the future, definitely.
Okay, thank you. Jenny?
Jenny, and next I will read for you a question that is written in the chat room. Okay, Jenny, your turn, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this talk. I don't have a question. It's more like I wanted to share my impression. I found your talk so refreshing. You know, this emphasis on openness and complexity, and that there's different theories and different ways of seeing things and understanding how people function. And I found it quite reassuring too, because this is what we're trying, or at least I'm trying, but I think a lot of us are trying to, as academic psychologists, teach to our students, you know, the future psychologists, to be able to understand complexity, to tolerate uncertainty, as they say in systemic thinking, you know, and that this is what you said when you answered one of the questions, that this is a skill, a very valuable skill for psychologists that allow them to think outside the box and find their way through the complex situations that we face, so that the fact that you, from your position, see this as the latest phase of psychology and the future of psychology is really very reassuring. Thank you very much for that.
You're welcome. But I think, you know, sometimes we have felt that it's a kind of a weakness that we haven't got a single answer for things. And it's not, it's a strength. It's an absolute strength. What it isn't is a good thing to try to communicate to politicians or decision makers. You know, one thing that they really don't want, as Christoph said at the EFPA conference, one thing they really don't want to hear is "it depends." That's one thing we always want to say. You know, we have to get away from the kind of reticence that says we dare not put our point of view as if it's fact, because medics have their own points of view and they're quite happy to put them forward as facts, you know, and we have to learn to do that when we're talking with decision makers. But for us, our diversity, our ability to take into account numerous perspectives, the fact that we know there's not one single, that's a strength. It's an absolute strength. It's not a weakness. It's not anything we should ever apologize for. Sorry.
Okay. Just to read the question from Urania Karachaousidou in chat. How we as specialists can familiarize people that come from societies that are not informed about psychological treatment with the importance of it. Thank you for your time and attention.
That's such a big question, because it you know, it's really very difficult. If somebody says to you, well, why are you important? I mean, even I instantly go dumb. It's very hard to answer that one. But I think if you're talking to people who don't understand the need for therapy, really you have to, all you can really do is say that it works, and if you can, have a few examples of ways people have been helped by talking to a psychologist. Now, that's not easy, because the examples you can only give must be either ones with complete permission or sort of fictionalized versions. But I think it doesn't hurt to for a psychological society, to develop a few exemplars of things that people can use as illustrations as to how psychotherapy can help people. You know, if they can be fictional case studies, if you like, but it doesn't hurt to have examples like that on the website or whatever. How you convince governments that it's important, that's a whole other question. The only real thing that governments listen to, in my experience, is money. And what you do, is, I suppose, is convince them that it's a lot cheaper to have people who are psychologically healthy than to have people who are psychologically damaged. And we can help you develop a population which is psychologically healthier. I don't know. I'm thinking on my feet here because it's a big question and I don't really know how to address it. I hope that goes some way towards addressing it. You know, there are some people who will never accept therapy. You know, that's but there are also quite a few who haven't realized that actually they could be helped, who feel stuck in a situation where nobody can help. And yet when they do have therapy, they realize that actually they can do more. So I think actually little techniques like building agency, sense of agency, confidence, you know, things like that, getting positive thinking strategies better known, techniques, you know, get them into the everyday media or social media or something like that. Those are good ways. Getting younger people to be psychology influencers. That's another way, you know, I find, podcasts and all that sort of thing. So there are ways, but it's not an easy thing. It depends on the individual always. These things always do.
We have another question in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your presentation. I'd like to ask if mental illness is on the rise, and if yes, why?
Okay. Oh, have I? Yeah, the answer is yes, globally across the world. And I was recently part of a UNESCO discussion panel about the psychology of this and what can be done to ameliorate it. And the whole thing is that the statistics of mental illness have become, yes, it's on the rise right across the world. And I think there are some reasons for that. To do what they found in UNESCO is that although people's living standards have improved globally, their quality of life has not improved. Now, as to why that is, one can only speculate. I don't know why that is, but I think we have a number of issues going on in the modern world. Sorry, and one of them is alienation. Is the way that people are disengaged from involvement. One of the things you find is that major strategies in helping people with mental illness is getting them involved in projects, social projects, you know, projects of one sort or another. And what that does is to give them a sense of meaningfulness in their lives, that they're actually contributing to something over and above just survival. And I think that's, as we become more able to feed ourselves and so on, that can generate alienation, which can help mental illness, you know, generate. And then there's there's always the question of young people and mental illness, and there is undoubtedly a rise in perceptions of young people and mental illness. It's questionable whether there is, okay, statistically there's a rise, yes, you know, you can count the numbers, there are lots more people. On the other hand, there were societies, forms of Western societies, which were, where forms of mental illness were just suppressed and not recognized. It is possible that there have always been levels of it. It's like neurodiversity. There have always been, people who were autistic or things, but it hasn't been recognized as such, or hyperactive. You know, there have always been kids who needed more physical activity than others, you know. Partly that's individual differences, partly now we can identify it as neurodiversity. but whether the absolute numbers are there are increasing in terms of young people, or whether the problems are being more recognized, I don't know. There have always been children, for instance, who've been distressed by bullying in the classroom or, you know, in the playground, and for whom that has left permanent scars. Many of them are walking around as adults, not telling anybody about it because they don't think it's important. Whereas a modern child may be more inclined to tell somebody about it and to be recognized as having problems as a result. Does that make sense? I'm not dismissing it. I'm saying it's always been there. Perhaps we're better at recognizing it than we were. But I think there is a general issue about alienation as well. But these are only my opinions. They are not, you know, I'm not giving facts. I don't know any facts. Excuse me.
Sorry. Thank you, Nicky. We have a question also written in a chatting room, but I see the hand from Professor Simina Rali from University of Athens. So, Mina, ask your question, and then I will read the question written.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hayes, for this nice talk this afternoon. I have a question that I would like to have maybe a comment from you. We all know that new categories of disorders are added in the DSM, or others are subtracted from DSM. Would you like to give us a comment on that?
Well, there are fewer that are subtracted than are added. And yes, I have a comment. I have a comment that there is a grave danger of medicalizing or pathologizing individual differences. And I think DSM in particular is also totally insensitive to cultural differences in expressions and things like that. There are other ways of classifying, other methods of classifying mental disorders that are less extreme than DSM. It's just that DSM is more popular. But for example, I mean, we have work in the UK, which, you know, pointing out that young men of West Indian origin, right, the West Indian families tend to express themselves very forcefully. And if you go strictly by DSM criteria, as many psychiatrists do, they can be classified as being manic, you know, as actually having a disorder. What all they're doing really is acting in accordance with what's culturally acceptable in their world. And I think DSM has gone far too far down the realm of classifying disorders because they seem to be socially deviant from white middle class behavior, you know. And we have to remember, you know, that in the southern United States, you know, drapetomania was a common diagnosis, and it was a diagnosis for slaves who ran away from their plantations. Yeah, the use of psychiatry to medicalize perfectly understandable human behavior. Does that make sense? So that's my comment. I mean, I'm not rubbishing the whole of DSM criteria. I'm saying that I think it goes too far in terms of identifying as disorders things which are actually individual differences. People are diverse. People are of many different kinds, and there is a very dangerous trend to try to normalize everything, you know, and fit us all into one size fits all. And we're not like that.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I will just read the two questions written in the chatting room, and just I'm wondering if you are tired, Nicky, and it is necessary, or we need to complete to finish all the procedure. Well, let's start with the questions, and then we will see. How could psychology cooperate with psychiatry without dominating one another.
Yeah, I don't see that as a problem. You know, what we're talking about here is teamwork. You know, there is absolutely no reason why people with different specialisms can't work as a team. You know, a theatre nurse will work alongside a radiologist, you know, in terms of, sorry, an anaesthetist, in order to achieve the same results in medical theatre. The important thing is the recognition of, okay, there are two aspects. One is the recognition of mutual professionalism, and the other is the question of an imbalance of power. And it is true that the medical profession has traditionally had greater power than other professions in all sorts of ways. Greater power than nursing, for instance, greater power than radiologists or anaesthetists and so on. But I don't see a problem in that, given that the two have very different skills and very different specialisms, personally. So when you say how can they work together, they can work together if they regard each other as members of the same team, and the team goal is to help people to deal with their problems. You know, if their problems are medical, they need a doctor. If their problems are psychiatric, then they may need a psychiatrist. In terms of the medical psychiatry, alternatively, they may need a therapist. It's only something that psychologists can work on, and psychology associations have to be very assertive about that, I think.
Last question. Does someone really need medicine to be cured, or sometimes it is treated as the easy way, and the easy way written in brackets?
I think absolutely it is sometimes treated as the easy way. I think there are times when medicine is necessary, of course. There are also times when it is possible to get someone to approach things in a different way. I had, when I was younger, a lot of problems with back pain. Medics didn't help. Going to an osteopath sorted it out, you know, as long as I did the exercises and things that they advised me to do. So it was like taking it into my hands rather than being dependent on the medicine was important. You know, I couldn't live on painkillers all my life, so I had to do something about it. I think it's a question of agency, really. If you regard yourself as responsible for your own health, then you go to a doctor if you feel you need a doctor. You do something about it yourself if you feel you can, you know, or you go to a therapist if you feel that your problem is more appropriate there. So I think there is a tendency to go for medicine. I worry very, very much about the use of medical therapies for children, for instance, when particularly with behavior disorders in children. I think I really don't like to see that, because I think that is introducing a level of disturbance in the physical body that can probably be better dealt with by different approaches to learning and therapy. But again, you know, we're talking about my opinion. I have fairly strong personal opinions about that. My own doctor takes notice if I do get in touch with her, because she says, well, I don't see you for 1 year, you know, at all. If I haven't seen you for the last 7 years, what's the matter? And she knows it's serious, because she knows I don't normally go to her. Whereas in my village, there are a lot of people who run to the doctor if they get an upset tummy. You know, it's that sort of problem. I think that it's about agency and taking control of your own health, and using the skills of specialists as you feel you need them. I don't know whether that answers the question or not.
Well, as we have realized that the discussion is quite interesting, but I don't want to exhaust our guest. So just one last question, if there is any.
Nico, how about your second question?
I think that it has already
One way or another.
yes answered. Do you see a raised hand? No. As for my second question, I think that it has been answered in somehow, but I will ask it. What about Nicky? Your opinion? What do you believe, do you consider to be the greatest challenges that psychology has to face in the future? Considering social questions and, of course, emerging technologies, emerging technology.
Okay. Well, I think there are three real aspects to that. Three big challenges that face us as we move on. And I think one of them is diversification. We've talked a lot about how psychology is diversifying, the need for different cultures, all this sort of thing. And I think the danger there is that we diversify so much that we fail to recognize what we have in common. And there's a great deal we have in common, but the nature of psychological knowledge is that once you know about it, it becomes internalized and you tend to forget that you knew that. You think you always thought like that, you know. So I think that's one of the points. We need to be able to recognize our common awareness while at the same time embracing diversity and different cultural areas. So that's one of the challenges which is facing us. Another major challenge which I've observed throughout my career and is not getting any less is the danger of over-specialization. It's the danger of the separation of different areas of psychology, because as academics we work in our own specialist area and we communicate with others working in that specialist area. A long time ago, when I was doing my PhD, I was looking at social representations and the shared social beliefs, and because I was also writing textbooks at the time, looking at in cognitive psychology, there was a whole area that was developing about lay beliefs and everyday, and they overlapped but were not the same. But the two groups of psychologists were completely unaware that they were dealing with the same area, but just in their own, coming from their own disciplines. And we need much more awareness of how academics can be studying the same human phenomena without being aware of each other's work. Much more collaboration in terms of human qualities and human abilities and things, rather than, we have collaboration, but we have international collaboration on topics, but we also have a huge level of specialization in academia and lots of pressures to specialize as well. There's not much pressure to go cross-discipline. There's only, so I think that's a second challenge. And the third challenge we face, to my mind, and this is a very personal opinion and not shared by everyone, is over-regulation. I think we are faced often with a bureaucratic environment which looks to categorize and articulate every aspect of the professional's work. Now, that's more developed in some countries than others, but you can see it. You can see it in the work of EFPA, you can see it in the American Psychological Association, wanting to regulate or categorize and articulate every aspect of the professional's work. And that fails to recognize the way that professionals bring the value of the experience and insight that professionals bring. They do a lot of training, they do a great deal of training, they also acquire a great deal of experience in terms of dealing with people. So it's not the case that their opinion is just the same as anyone else's. It's different. It's an informed opinion, it's a learned opinion, and it's worth recognizing. And I think, well, what's the point of professionals going through all that training and all that education and all that experience in terms of practice, supervised practice and things, if we're then going to try and regulate everything they do? So I think we have this danger. I think it's a danger in more walks of life than just psychology, over-regulating, of wanting to make rules that regulate people all the time. And maybe it comes back to this one-size-fits-all human being thing. I don't know. But I think that's a challenge which psychology needs to face up to, because while I'm in favor of attempts to articulate what the value of psychology is, I'm not in favor of attempting to regulate what psychology is, if you see what I mean, because we are a growing discipline. We change all the time. That's part of our strength. We deal with new areas. We take things up. We have to allow that growth. We have to allow, and we have to recognize the expertise that experienced psychologists in practice bring to their work, and the fact that their insight is valuable. So that, to me, is the third major challenge that we're facing as we move into the future. But, that's only my opinion. Like I said,
Yes, thank you.
It's not set in stone,
Mhm.
And a lot of people would really, really disagree with me on that one. I mean, I think okay, I'm not saying all regulation is bad. I think we do need some things. I talked earlier about ethical guidelines. The ethical guidelines for animal research were invaluable. The ethical guidelines for human research were invaluable. The codes of conduct we have for professional psychologists, great, we've got those. We want codes of conduct, we need them. So if we've got those, why do we need any further regulation? Because we've got professionals who are adhering to regulated to ethical practices, and we don't need to sort of monitor every little bit of access, every aspect of their work. As you can gather, it's a little bit of a hobby horse of mine.
Thank you. Dear Nicky, on behalf of the Executive Board of the Hellenic Psychological Society, on behalf of the members of the Hellenic Psychological Society, I really thank you for accepting our invitation to being here today with us. It was a great honor for all of us and for me especially. I really thank you. And I thank you all, my colleagues, all the friends of psychology that for your presence here today. Nicky, I really thank you.
I thank you for giving me the opportunity. I have enjoyed this and participating in this webinar, and thank you for your questions. Thank you for inviting me. As I said earlier, it is an honor and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
Nicky.
very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And thank you again for